Hello and welcome back to my studio. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and here you can see the result of today's experimentation, trying to kind of get that feeling of sunbeams coming in through the trees in the middle of a woodland. I wanted to keep it really fresh, really dynamic, just like sort of stumbling into a clearing and catching a moment. But first, I'm really excited to share with you that my new book, Landscapes in Watercolour, Techniques and Tutorials for the Complete Beginner, is available to order and pre-order, depending on where you are in the world. I'll see if I can get a link and leave it in the description below. But now, let's get back to today's demo. As always, I'm going to start off by really roughly sketching the scene out, just a few trees and a few indications of where I want my foliage. I'm working today on Milford cold press watercolour paper. It's taped to my board with ordinary decorator's masking tape, and my board is at an angle of about 20 to 30 degrees. So here's my very simple sketch. I may deviate from this, it depends how the washes progress. So for this experimental painting, I've had this idea, so I'm going to try it out, and that's often how these studio vlogs come together. And the idea is, as I hope you can see, is to paint in the sunbeams with clean water first, leaving some dry patches of paper and then seeing if placing the paint into the pre-wetted sunbeam shapes helps to give me the effect that I'm looking for. I'm using my Princeton Aqua Elite 1.5 inch Mottler brush, and this is cobalt blue, quite a light value. You can see I'm just putting the brush strokes very lightly into the pre-wetted sunbeam shapes. I've washed my brush out really quickly and removed the excess water from it and dipped into some cad yellow. I'm being careful to make sure my cad yellow stays separate from my cobalt blue because I don't really want it green in the sunny areas. I don't mind if it goes a little bit green around the edges because there's going to be a lot of foliage framing the sunbeams. Well, so far so good with the sky. I like the effects so far. We'll have to see how it dries, but I must continue and work quickly while everything's still damp. I've now picked up a much richer value, a creamier consistency of paint with mixtures of sap green, hooker's green, Payne's grey, burnt sienna, maybe a bit of raw umber, and using different amounts of that paint, so just dipping into different amounts, building up lots of lovely loose brush strokes with this lovely rich paint around the edges of the painting, starting off on the ground plane, and then I shall work up around the sides and the top, putting in some canopies, working quickly and working wet in wet. Now this is a clean damp flat brush and I'm pulling it through some of my sunbeam shapes just to emphasise them and maybe just slightly reposition them in places. Not too much, but just enough so I can sort of keep this illusion fairly convincing. And then back to my greens, trying to keep a nice variety by dipping into the slightly different shades. Trying to keep it a little bit lighter around the top with some nice sort of small dotty brush strokes which will soften into the damp sky wash and hopefully give me that illusion of canopy of leaves above and the heavier undergrowth in deep shadows below. Because I'm working wet in wet, everything will soften back as it dries and it'll dry a lot lighter as well. This is some absorbent kitchen paper or tissue, and I'm very lightly running it through and lifting out a bit of paint here and there, being careful not to lift out too much. Simply following the direction of the sunbeams that I've already established in my initial washes. So that's my frame pretty much in place. Now I want to get in some darker values. This is pretty much pure Payne's grey now, quickly added around the bottom while all the paint is still damp, so it will soften and diffuse into the other greens that are there, but give me some really nice deep shadows. And now that my foliage and ground plane framing device is in place, I want to finesse it slightly. While everything is still damp, I can drop in some really nice little wet in wet brushstroke dabs using my small calligraphy brush and the different varieties of green that I've mixed, and just dot them around here and there so that I begin to build up the suggestions of my little loose leaves at the end of my branches. I want to keep this really loose, very impressionistic, almost abstract. And it won't really look like much until we get the trees in, but what I'm doing now is trying to set the scene. If I paint in all these little marks wet on dry later on, they'll all be very hard, but if I put these in now where the paint is damp and where the page is still a bit damp, then they will soften and diffuse and give me some really pretty layers of foliage. I'm being guided by my pencil drawing earlier. I can see my pencil lines, and so where I'm putting these little dots and little brush marks, it's all around the little branches that I've already put indications in my sketch. So I'm following my road map. And I'm pretty much happy with that now. So what I'm going to do is lay my board flat. Once the board is flat, my washes shouldn't move around too much. And then I'm going to take some ordinary table salt, it's fine ground, and I'm going to sprinkle a little tiny bit of salt, not too much, into the ground plane and the canopies, being careful to only sprinkle a few grains in each area, and this hopefully will just give me the subtle impression of a tangle of plants, brambles and undergrowth, and also sort of sunlight catching some little leaves in the canopies. I made sure that my washes are almost dry, they're just damp, so I should get quite subtle effects from the salt. I now need to leave it all to dry completely. So here's the dry painting. I've raised it back up to 20 to 30 degrees tilt, and I've brushed off any remaining crumbs of salt, and I'm very pleased with the effects and how the washes have dried. Now I need to paint in my trees. I'm starting off with a small round brush, but I quickly changed to my small calligraphy brush, or you could use a lining brush or a rigger, because I've decided I need quite a fine brush in order to put in the delicate marks for these trees. I'm working around some of the marks that are already there that create the sunbeams, and that makes sure that we get some sunbeams coming in front of these trees as well as behind them. I'm following my pencil lines, but I'm not feeling strictly that I need to follow them completely. I'm going to keep this quite minimal. I want this to be a fairly minimalistic painting, and I want the trees just to follow the same directionality, or to complement the directionality of the sunbeams, if you see what I mean. By preserving the light in the middle of the paper and having the darker values framing it, then we can use this sort of diagonal orientation of the trees and the branches to our advantage from a compositional point of view. You can see I'm bringing these small branches down into the lighter area, but I'm also using the branches I'm connecting the branches rather to the little dots that I put in wet for the foliage. Less is more with something like this. And as I paint, I'm being mindful of where I have my suggested weeds and brambles, ferns and brackens, etc. in the undergrowth, and I'm painting around that, trying to integrate the trees into the suggested landscape. You can see I'm taking the pressure off of my brush as I reach the ends of the branches where they become finer, and that way I get a finer line. The mixture of paint I'm using for my tree trunks and branches is Payne's Grey, Cobalt Blue and some Burnt Sienna. So I think I'm just going to have these 3 trees this time. As it's an experiment, I just want to see how little I can sort of get away with using in, or as fewer features as possible, because the star of the show for me here is the sunbeams. And I think if I put too many trees, too many branches in, I'm in danger of overworking it. But at the moment, I think I'm pretty pleased with the way this experiment has gone. And I think it's really important as you're learning to paint with watercolours, especially for beginners, to really take the pressure off yourselves and have these times in the studio where you're not trying to paint a finished painting, where you're just trying out ideas, trying out something new. I think I'm almost done now, just a few sort of final little touches here and there. And then when I feel that I've done enough, then I'll take the tape off, and that gives me the chance to look at it with fresh eyes. As soon as I see it with a clean white border, it helps me to reassess it and decide whether I need to make any minor adjustments to the painting. And I'm thinking I'd just like to soften that tree trunk on the right a little bit, but it's dry, so I can't soften it. So I'm going to add a little bit more paint carefully to the bottom and then soften that added paint. Just smudge it down into the undergrowth, and then I'm going to darken up a few of the tree trunks where they might have lightened back a bit too much. And then into that fresh dark paint I can use a paper towel and just dab off lightly to create a bit of texture. And here's the finished painting. And this photograph shows you how it looks in real life rather than being slightly bleached out as the lights in my studio always do. And I hope you found that helpful, and I hope you enjoyed watching me paint it as much as I enjoyed actually painting it. If you're new to the channel, I'd love it if you would subscribe to our channel and give us a thumbs up. It's free to do and it really helps with our reach. It lets the YouTube algorithm know that people are interested in watching our demos. And thank you so much to everyone that supports us on Patreon. We really do appreciate each and every one of you, and we couldn't run the channel without you. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.